making each other aware of what that means. The expression of disagreement can be verbal or nonverbal, and we haven't really touched on that quite yet, but if you consider that, remember, so much of what we say in a conversation is nonverbal. So sometimes the way that we bring that to the attention of others is nonverbally. And if you just want to take a second, briefly consider what are ways that you can tell the other person's getting frustrated without them saying it. I mean, I can think of 3 or 4 right off the top of my head. There are certain ways that we communicate we're frustrated and we don't have to say anything. So that disagreement can be brought, to the forefront non-verbally. And it is recommended not to wait until frustration is intense to share it. In other words, really guard against letting something fester and you get frustrated once and you don't say anything, and then they do the same thing again and it makes you more frustrated, and over time that builds and builds and builds, and then when you finally bring it up, you explode about it because you've had months of frustration about this issue, wherein the other person is completely oblivious to the fact that they've been frustrating you. And so if you wait until it's so intense to share it, the likelihood is that you're not going to be able to clearly communicate your feelings and your thoughts and your requests because the frustration takes over. Okay, so the beginning, I don't know how those got switched. I actually thought to myself, why didn't I talk about the beginning? But okay, so just pretend these are in the other order. Frustration awareness. So recognition by one of the people that differences are becoming a problem. Okay, so at the very, this is going to be really confusing for you also. Okay, I'm gonna do it in the other order. So when we look at source, prior conditions, where are they coming from? What's being brought to the table that creates the issue, right? Okay, so then we first are looking at frustration. We're becoming aware that differences are an issue. This is when self-talk comes in, noting that something is wrong and is generating frustration. So when you first start to hear that inner dialogue of, are you kidding me? Or, oh my gosh, or any of those self-talks where you are communicating to yourself, okay, this is starting to bother me. That's the beginning of the conflict. It's being aware of differences, not necessarily increasing frustration. So it's an acknowledgement that differences are there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to continue to get worse. And then frustration rises when the differences interfere with something you want to accomplish. Because remember, we want our goals to be achieved and our needs to be met. So frustration rises when those differences are interfering in our needs and goals. Okay? So now we go to middle. Sorry, I don't know how those got out of order. So middle, active conflict, not necessarily emotionally intense, expression of disagreement, maybe verbal or nonverbal, and then make sure that you communicate it early on. Don't wait until it gets out of control. Okay, so now we're at the end. The resolution of the conflict. Once you start to manage the conflict, the moment that you begin taking steps to manage and handle the conflict, you are in the resolution phase. And often we think resolution means the conflict is over. But it's helpful to consider we're already in resolution as soon as we are managing the conflict. And that can give us some hope and some encouragement and some guarantee that we're not going to deal with this issue forever. Now, kind of on the darker side of the coin, resolution is not always possible, however. Divorce is an example of a solution with no resolution. That's a solution, but it's not a resolution, and that's important to notice that difference. And so, I don't want to say that resolution should not be a goal, because it should be, but sometimes resolution does not take place, and so we need to be okay with that and accepting of that if that's true. And then finally, the aftermath is when we follow up. So when we follow up, we are dealing with hurt feelings that may still be lingering, or we're managing simmering grudges. So basically, and sometimes you can consider the aftermath individually. The aftermath does not necessarily have to include the other person, at least initially. You may just want to check to confirm that the conflict has just not retreated back to the frustration awareness phase. In other words, it's almost like a self-check. So do I still have hurt feelings about this issue? Am I still harboring a grudge about this issue? Have we dealt with it just enough where it's back on the back burner? I'm still frustrated about it, and I'm still aware that it's there, but it's not really something we need to address at this moment. So those are all things that you kind of do internally, and then you will clarify and confirm with the other person. So you follow up with them. I just wanted to, I think a lot of times we say, are we okay? And that's the way that we do our aftermath if we're, close with someone and we want to just make sure everything's okay. But, it's helpful to clarify and confirm what exactly is happening, what we're feeling, what we're thinking. Okay, so let me quickly address a few more things I wanted to talk about. Conflict is constructive if it helps build new insights or establishes new patterns in a relationship. Remember, we talked about sometimes it can be helpful if it brings to light an issue that needs to be addressed. So if it can create new insight for someone or establish a new pattern, that's very constructive, that's very healthy. There are times when we need to have things addressed and have things talked about and processed. So conflict can be very helpful. Another food for thought question: what are some benefits from conflict in interpersonal relationships? If you have an experience with a beneficial conflict, I would love to hear about it. And you don't have to share really personal things, but what are some benefits that you've had come out of conflict? Now, on the other side of that, conflict can be destructive when differences are viewed as win-lose rather than looking for a solution that allows both individuals to gain. And we're actually going to look at all of the different options for the win-lose in just a minute. So we'll get into that in more detail. But if we remember, we're trying to think of this as a problem to be solved, not a battle to be won. So if we're thinking about, I have to win and you have to lose, that makes conflict destructive because we're not collaborating, we're not cooperating, we're not working together for something where we both benefit in the end. Okay, this might be a good time to take a break if you need one because we're kind of moving into a new phase. So if you want to pause me, go ahead. So if we're looking at conflict management styles, we've talked about listening styles, we've talked about communication styles. Well, now we're going to talk about conflict management styles. No one uses a single style in all situations, and I think a lot of you recognize that about your listening styles as well. You said, well, my listening style varies depending on who I'm speaking with and the situation, etc. So similar to conflict management as well. But the 5 styles are avoidance, accommodation, competition, compromise, and collaboration. So we'll look at those, but 3 C's, 2 A's, I'm trying to keep it easy for you, but 5 styles, conflict management, you're not going to use one only ever. You will use probably most of them, if not all of them, but you will tend to gravitate toward 1 or 2 more than another. There tends to be a dominant and a secondary style that you will typically use, most of the time. So avoidance is a lose-lose approach. So both people in a conflict, if you are using the conflict management style of avoidance, both partners lose. Basically, it's wishing the problem will go away by itself or will work itself out on its own. And as Dr. Phil would say, how's that working out for you? Often that's not practical and it's not helpful. So what ends up happening is when you have an avoidance style, it appears that you're uninterested in managing the conflict or in meeting the need of the other person, which further contributes to the conflict. Because if the person says, gosh, I just feel like you don't want to talk about it, you don't want to address it, you don't want to understand what I need from you, then the conflict is perpetuated. Now, I will acknowledge that maybe sometimes you just dislike the hassle of dealing with an uncomfortable situation. I happen to be a conflict avoider, I will admit. I guess probably the way I was raised and my experience is I'm a pretty low-key, laid-back, peaceful person, and I like it that way. So I've had to work on being a little bit more assertive, and I've had to work on being open to uncomfortable situations when there's a conflict. But, the example there, husbands avoid confrontation as a way of managing conflict. That is a very, very common marital issue, is that wives feel that husbands will just avoid, like I've had a lot of women say to me, yeah, they just sweep it under the rug. Just pretend it's not there. And that's the way that they manage conflict. And in reality, the impression then is that you're not interested in addressing it or meeting the needs of the other person. Now, you do have an advantage in avoidance because it gives you a chance to step back and regroup. However, if you step back and regroup and never take it any further, it's not an advantage. You have to have follow-up after that. A disadvantage, obviously, is sending the message of apathy. You just don't care. I'm going to just pretend it doesn't exist and move on. Okay. Accommodation, the second A. If you think about someone who accommodates you, they give in to you. So giving in to the demands of others. If that's your style, if you are an accommodator, you give in to the demands of others in conflict. And this can stem from the fear of rejection and that fear of rocking the boat. And so that can be, your motivation, or that can be your experience that, if I rock the boat, really bad things happen, so I'm just going to make sure that other people are happy, and that's fine. Sometimes you may just want to meet others' needs and you're willing to sacrifice your own. So accommodation does not necessarily have to be a negative thing, but it needs to be done in balance though. There are times when you will sacrifice your own needs to meet the needs of others. Almost in that example I shared with you before, who is it more important to? It was more important for me to have the recycling put out, so I was willing to sacrifice my own needs, and I said, fine, I will take the recycling bin out to the street. And that's a pretty silly example. There are much more emotionally driven examples, but sometimes we say, okay, fine, I'm willing to sacrifice what I want or what I need so that, your needs are further met. Okay, great. But it should not be a consistent thing. That can be very hurtful. And this is a lose-win approach because you are automatically losing. When you give in to the demands of others, you are giving the other person the win and you are accepting the lose. The advantage is you're definitely other-oriented, so that's a positive thing. We've been working on other orientation, so that would be certainly a success. But the disadvantage is it avoids resolution, because if you just give in to the demands of others, a resolution is never determined. It's a solution, not a resolution. And you may diminish your power over time and be taken advantage of. Remember, we talked about if someone's really needy, the other person has the power. Well, if someone is a doormat and gets walked all over all the time, the other person has all the power in that situation too. So you can be taken advantage of if you are, pretty excessively an accommodator. Okay, so competition, another management style, a win-lose approach. So notice that before we had a lose-win approach because I automatically lose, you automatically win. Competition management style is win-lose. So I win, you lose. Winning at the expense of the other person. Thinking about it in terms of a battle that must be won. I'm going to compete until I conquer, and I'm going to make sure that I have the victory here. Now, when you're a competitive manager in your style, you may resort to blaming rather than assuming responsibility. So that can be a person who plays the blame game and, never sees the personality of themselves and how that affects the situation. It can also result in threats or warnings, and the threat can be carried out. So, if you do that again, I'm going to. And so that those threats and warnings can be a back and forth issue. Warning is prophecy that you can't control. So, those are the negatives of the threats and warnings in a conflict, because the threat can be carried out, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, and the warning is a prophecy that you don't have control over. So, you only have control over yourself. So